I came back to my lake mansion expecting quiet, but instead I found HOA Karen standing in my driveway with a clipboard, telling me she had reserved my property for her daughter's birthday party and that 200 guests would be arriving in a matter of days. That was the moment the air shifted. She didn't just claim the lawn or the dock. She claimed the entire house as if my legacy, my refuge, my home, was nothing more than a community rental hall. And she said it so casually, as if she were doing me a favor. What she didn't know was that by trying to take everything from me, she had already written the opening chapter of her own downfall. Before I tell you how I ended up suing every single one of those 200 guests for $100,000 each, let me ask you something. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is, because you're not going to believe how far this Karen went before she collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. I had inherited the mansion not long ago, after years of it sitting empty and neglected. It wasn't just a piece of property. It was family history carved into oak beams and stone fireplaces, mornings fishing off the dock with my father when I was young, evenings listening to the lake carry echoes of loons across still water. When I bought it back from foreclosure and started restoring it, I told myself this place would be my retreat from a noisy world, a quiet sanctuary where I could hear my own thoughts. That promise lasted until the HOA president herself, Karen, rolled up in her luxury SUV, stepped out in high heels on my gravel drive, and announced like a queen addressing a servant that she had found the perfect venue for her daughter's birthday bash. She wore sunglasses big enough to block out the sun and an expression that told me she had never been denied a thing in her life. "You should be proud," she said, scribbling on her clipboard. "This will put the mansion back on the map. 200 guests, live music, catering. Everyone will talk about it for years." She didn't ask. She declared. She didn't smile. She smirked, as if she already knew the outcome. I stood on my own steps, arms crossed, and said, "That's funny. I don't remember agreeing to rent out my own house." Her laugh was sharp, practiced, like she'd used it to bulldoze over a dozen neighbors before me. "Consent is implied," she told me, snapping her fingers at a man in a polo shirt carrying a clipboard of his own. "The HOA has discretion to use community assets for the good of all. You don't want to stand in the way of progress, do you?" I stared at her, letting the silence sit heavy between us. Finally I said, "Progress usually comes with permission slips and contracts. You don't have either." That set the tone. She thought she could cow me with her authority and reputation, the way she probably had with weaker neighbors. I wasn't one of them, but I also knew better than to shout or rage. Rage is what she wanted. It would feed her story of the angry recluse who lived in the mansion and refused to cooperate. No, I stayed calm, measured, steady, because nothing unsettles arrogance more than quiet certainty. As the days passed, her arrogance only grew. A letter appeared in my mailbox accusing me of noncompliance with HOA regulations, claiming my hedges were out of community standard. Another said my dock was improperly permitted. Each letter came with a threat of fines that stacked higher than the timber beams of my house. I knew it was all manufactured. None of those rules applied to me. My property had been exempt from HOA jurisdiction since long before Karen moved in with her SUV and her clipboard. But her strategy was clear. Bury me in paper until I folded. One morning I caught landscapers on my lawn, cutting hedges and marking spaces with spray paint as if my yard were their construction site. "Who told you to be here?" I asked. They pointed back at the road where Karen's SUV sat idling, her window down, her arm dangling lazily as she scrolled through her phone. "She did," one of them muttered. "I told them to leave." When Karen rolled up seconds later, I leaned down to her open window. "This is private property," I said. "Not a playground, not a venue, not yours." She smirked again, lips curling in that way that dared me to fight her. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just landscaping. You'll thank me when 200 guests are admiring your lawn." That night I sat on the porch, watching the water shimmer under the moon, and I thought about what my father used to say, That land isn't just dirt and trees, it's a mirror of who you are. If you let someone walk over it, you let them walk over you. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't budge an inch. I tried going through the sheriff first. When I showed him the letters, he sighed, looked at the badge on his chest as if it weighed 100 pounds, and said, "Civil matter. Best to get a lawyer." He knew Karen well, knew how she operated, but his hands were tied. I tried the county inspector too, when Karen filed a complaint about my dock. He walked through, took some notes, then said, "Looks fine to me, but the HOA paperwork complicates things. You'll need to fight it in court." Everyone I turned to had the same answer: fight or fold. She counted on me folding. Neighbors started whispering when I walked into town. An old store owner leaned across his counter and said, "You're in her sights now. She's been talking about that mansion for years. Thinks it should be the community crown jewel." A younger neighbor, nervous, told me, "She runs this place. Don't mess with her." But another, quieter voice said, "Good luck. Someone needs to stand up to her." I realized then that this wasn't just about me. Karen had bullied the whole community into submission. My mansion was just the biggest target she'd ever aimed for. Her arrogance hit its peak when trucks started arriving. Big rental trucks, dropping off tables and stage equipment like it was already settled. I stopped one driver, asked for the work order, and sure enough it said, "Lake Mansion, birthday event, authorized by HOA president." No mention of me, the owner. When I confronted Karen that afternoon, she didn't even flinch. "Relax," she said, her heels clicking on the gravel. "It's already arranged. You'll just embarrass yourself if you keep fighting it." I looked at her, calm, steady, as the wind off the lake carried the sound of birds across the water. "If you're so sure of yourself, Karen, I'll let you keep digging this hole. But don't be surprised when you find out it's your name on the shovel." She tilted her head, confused, but I didn't explain. I just walked back into my house, shut the heavy oak door, and listened to the echo of it seal her out. In that moment I wasn't worried. I was planning. Because she thought she had beaten me, but I already knew how her party would end. She thought the mansion was hers to flaunt, but she had just walked into a trap she couldn't see. And I had all the patience in the world to let her arrogance destroy her. The letters kept coming as if Karen had a printing press running just for me, each envelope with the HOA logo stamped in the corner like some official decree of power, but inside it was always the same nonsense. Fines for hedges too high, warnings about paint colors that hadn't changed in decades, accusations that my dock was a hazard to the community even though it had stood solid for years without a single complaint. She wasn't trying to enforce rules, she was trying to break me down by paper cuts, hoping that if she buried me under enough empty threats I'd finally give up and let her have her way. I refused to play into it, but the sheer persistence of her campaign was almost impressive. One morning I found landscapers again on my lawn, acting as though they belonged, clipping at bushes and measuring ground for what looked like tent setups. I stopped them and demanded to know who gave permission. One pointed at the street where Karen's SUV sat gleaming, her hand raised in a half-wave like she was blessing the land. I told them to leave immediately, and when they hesitated, I reminded them that trespassing citations could cost them dearly. They packed their tools and drove off, muttering that they were only following orders. Karen rolled down her window as I walked toward her car, that same smug look plastered on her face. "Don't be so uptight," she said. "You'll see how good this will be for the community when everyone's laughing and dancing on your lawn." I leaned down, kept my voice even, and said, "That's the problem, Karen. It's not your lawn. And laughter at someone else's expense isn't progress. It's theft." She didn't flinch, but I saw the twitch in her jaw, the flicker of annoyance that her charm wasn't working. She drove off without another word, but I knew it wasn't the end. That week, a county inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, claiming there were anonymous reports that my dock extended too far into the water. He was polite, even embarrassed, and when he measured, he admitted everything was within code. Still, He told me he had to file a report because the HOA had demanded it. Another day, a survey crew arrived unannounced, staking little orange flags in my yard, as if preparing to redraw the property lines. I chased them off, took photos, and told them if they stepped back onto my land I'd press charges. One man grumbled that Karen said she had authorization. I told him authorization without ownership was worthless. Each of these incidents piled up like kindling, and I knew one spark would set the fire roaring. It wasn't just me who felt the heat. The whole community began whispering. At the general store, the owner leaned over his counter and said, "She's telling everyone the mansion's going to host the party of the decade. Says it'll raise property values." Folks are starting to believe her. Another neighbor caught me outside, looking nervous. "She runs this place," he said. "She'll drag you through court for years if you don't give in. No one wins against her." But then there were others, quieter, who nodded at me in solidarity. An older man whose house had been fined for having the wrong mailbox design muttered, "Good on you. Someone needs to finally stand up to her." The sheriff remained neutral, shrugging his shoulders when I showed him photos of landscapers trespassing and trucks unloading gear. "Civil matter," he kept saying, his badge heavy on his chest. "Unless she breaks something or someone, I can't do much. Best you get a lawyer." It was the same refrain, echoing through every interaction, fight or fold. Karen thrived on this imbalance. She strutted around the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen about her grand vision. I overheard her once, standing with an investor by the edge of the lake, describing the mansion as if she already owned it. "This will be the jewel of the community," she said. "Imagine the photos, the headlines. Everyone will talk about it. We'll set the standard for prestige living." The investor nodded, scribbling notes, and I realized she was leveraging my house to sell her own image. She wasn't just planning a party, she was staging a spectacle to cement her control. And in doing so, she made the stakes higher for me. This wasn't just about 200 guests trampling my land. This was about my identity, my dignity, and my right to defend the legacy I had rebuilt. When the trucks started arriving with tables, chairs, and decorations, it was clear she had no intention of stopping. I intercepted a driver unloading folding tables and asked to see his work order. It listed the mansion as the venue, signed by HOA President Karen herself, with no mention of the owner. I told him to load everything back up and leave, and when he hesitated, I explained the legal risk he was taking by unloading on private property without consent. He left, but not without shooting me a look that said he expected trouble. Later that evening, I saw Karen directing another truck toward the lawn, her sunglasses glinting even though the sun had nearly set. "You're wasting your breath," she told me when I blocked the driveway. "This event is happening with or without you. Everyone's already expecting it. If you keep pushing, you'll be the one who looks like the villain." Her strategy was painfully transparent. She wanted me to lash out, to shout, to become the unhinged property owner who refused to share. Then she could spin her narrative of being the selfless leader bringing joy to the community. But I didn't bite. I stood there calmly, arms folded, while her words slid off me like water off stone. "If everyone's expecting it," I said, "then they'll be very disappointed when they realize the invitation was a lie. I hope you're ready to explain that." For a moment, the corners of her smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered, flicking her hair and turning back to the truck driver. In town, gossip spread like wildfire. Some people told me to cut my losses, to let her have her party because the backlash would be worse than fighting. Others cheered quietly for me, saying they wished they'd had the courage to push back when Karen trampled over their boundaries. I knew the community was watching closely, measuring me against her, deciding who would crack first. That realization didn't scare me, it motivated me. Because if I let her win, it wouldn't just be my land at stake. It would send the message that she could take anything from anyone with enough arrogance and paperwork. One night, as I sat on the porch, the moon casting silver across the lake, I thought again of my father's words. Land is more than property. It is proof that you stood your ground when no one else would. I knew then that every hedge she trimmed without permission, every letter she mailed, every truck she sent onto my lawn was fuel for the fire I would light later. She thought she was tightening the noose around my neck, but she was really wrapping the rope around her own. And the community, whether they realized it yet or not, would be the audience when that rope finally pulled taut. So I stayed calm, I stayed patient, and I let her keep stacking the deck higher and higher. Because I already had a plan forming, one that would turn her 200 invited guests from her greatest triumph into her greatest humiliation. And all I needed to do was let her arrogance keep leading her closer to the edge. The day I knew she had finally crossed the line was when I came back from town and saw cameras, banners, and a small crowd gathered in front of my mansion as if it were already a public venue. Karen stood at the center of it all, wearing a bright suit and holding oversized scissors, preparing to cut a ceremonial ribbon stretched across my driveway. She had invited a handful of investors, reporters from the local paper, and neighbors curious enough to watch the spectacle. With a voice loud enough to echo off the lake, she declared that the lake mansion would be the crown jewel of the community and that her daughter's birthday party would mark the beginning of a new tradition for years to come. She spoke as though I didn't exist, as if the ownership of the property had somehow been transferred to her by sheer force of confidence. People clapped politely, others looked uncomfortable, and I stood just inside my gate, watching in silence. When she raised those scissors to cut the ribbon, I knew I had reached the end of patience. It was no longer a matter of stopping a party. It was about drawing a line so clear that no one would ever dare step over it again. That night, when the crowd dispersed and the ribbons blew loose in the wind, I began making calls. My lawyer answered first, and when I explained what Karen had done and what she was planning, he chuckled dryly and said, "She really doesn't know what kind of fire she's playing with, does she?" I told him I didn't want to just stop the party. I wanted every guest, every vendor, every single person who thought they had the right to set foot on my property without permission to be accountable. He explained the path to me, each step legal, each step binding, each step far more devastating than Karen could imagine. If she filled my land with 200 people, then each of those people would commit trespass the second they crossed my boundary. And with the right documentation, signage, and preparation, I could pursue damages from each one individually. Suddenly it wasn't just about stopping Karen's event. It was about turning her celebration into the weapon of her own destruction. 4 days I worked quietly. I installed high-definition cameras covering every inch of the driveway, lawn, and dock. I posted clear signs at the entrances that said private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted, and each sign was date-stamped and photographed for evidence. I hired a security consultant to walk the perimeter and verify that everything was legally sound. I even reinforced my gates with steel so that when the convoy of guests arrived, they would have to make a conscious choice to step past the barriers. My lawyer prepared template lawsuits, each one already drafted with blanks for names, dates, and details, ready to be filed the moment the party happened. He explained how the damages could be set at $100,000 per violation, a number that would terrify anyone dragged into court. I listened carefully, nodded, and said, "Make sure they're ready." He told me it was rare to see someone prepare a defense this meticulously, and I told him it wasn't defense. It was offense. Karen, meanwhile, strutted around town as if she had already won. She told the store owner that invitations had gone out to 200 guests, vendors were booked, and the mansion would finally serve a purpose greater than one man's peace. She paraded through the neighborhood with her daughter, pointing toward my property as though it were theirs by divine right. Her daughter smiled and thanked her loudly in front of others, calling it the most exciting gift she could imagine. I heard whispers of neighbors receiving formal invitations with my address printed in gold ink, a catered menu attached, and a schedule of events including music, speeches, and even a fireworks display over the lake. Karen boasted that the sheriff would be present to ensure safety, implying his support. When I saw him later, he shook his head and muttered, "Don't drag me into her circus. I'll be there if things get out of hand, but she's on her own." His neutrality was frustrating, but I knew it would turn the moment he saw the evidence I was collecting. The more she boasted, the calmer I felt. She was setting herself up without realizing it, stacking her tower of arrogance higher and higher while I quietly prepared the ground beneath it to collapse. I made copies of every letter she had sent me, documented every trespass, and logged every delivery truck that attempted to set foot on my land. I knew the courts would eat it up when the time came. I made one final visit to my lawyer to confirm the strategy, and he told me, "You're going to bankrupt half the guest list if this goes the way you think." I replied, "That's the beauty of it." She invited them into my trap. The night before the event, I watched from my window as Karen's convoy rolled in with more equipment. Crews strung lights across the edge of my property, hung banners between trees, and stacked crates of wine near the dock. I walked out calmly, documented everything with my camera, and told them they were officially on notice. Some workers looked nervous and packed up, others shrugged and said they were only following orders, and Karen herself strolled up in a sparkling dress rehearsal outfit, waving her arms as if presenting a theater stage. "Tomorrow," she said, "this place will be alive again. You should be proud." I stared at her and said, "Tomorrow this place will teach you a lesson you'll never forget." She narrowed her eyes, but I turned and walked away, leaving her puzzled. Inside, I sat by the fireplace, the warmth flickering across the walls that had seen generations before me, and I felt no fear, only anticipation. She thought she had trapped me into humiliation, but in truth she had brought me the greatest gift: witnesses. 200 people would walk willingly into my lawsuit, each one captured on camera, each one documented by signage, each one confirming my claim. Karen's greatest triumph was about to become her most public defeat, and the very community she had bullied for years would be there to see it unravel. The plan was set, the papers ready, the cameras armed. All that remained was for the party to begin. When I stepped outside again that night, the lake was calm, the stars mirrored in its surface, and I thought of my father's words one last time. "A man who does not defend his land does not defend himself." Tomorrow I would not just defend it. I would reclaim respect for it, and in doing so, I would show every neighbor that arrogance and entitlement have a cost. Karen believed she could take everything from me. She would soon discover that she had handed me everything I needed to take everything from her. And as I closed the door, the faint sound of laughter from her preparations still echoing across the water, I couldn't help but smile. Because tomorrow, when the first guest arrived, the trap would finally spring shut. The morning of the party dawned with a strange silence, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, except the storm in this case was made of SUVs, limousines, delivery vans, and buses that began to crawl down the road toward my lake mansion as if the entire county had been invited. I stood by my reinforced gate, coffee in hand, watching as drivers in pressed suits opened doors for women in gowns and men in polished shoes, all of them stepping out with the casual entitlement of people who thought they belonged. They laughed, adjusted their sunglasses, and walked right up to the gates, stopping only when they saw the large signs posted in bold letters. "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." Some chuckled nervously, assuming the signs were leftovers from the mansion's vacant years. Others ignored them completely, brushing past as if the words didn't apply to them. That was the moment the first trap was sprung, because every single one of those steps was captured on my cameras, time-stamped and documented, proof of willful trespass. Karen arrived last, of course, her SUV gleaming, music blasting as if to announce her arrival. She stepped out in a flowing dress that screamed money and power, raising her arms to the crowd like a queen greeting her subjects. "Welcome to the new era of our community," she declared, her voice carrying over the lawn. I didn't move. I let her bask for a moment, then I stepped forward, calm, measured, and said, welcome to your lawsuit." The crowd murmured, some laughing, thinking it was a joke, but I wasn't smiling. I pointed at the cameras, the signs, and the stack of folders in the hands of my lawyer, who had arrived just in time to stand at my side. "By stepping past those gates," I said, my voice steady, "you've each committed trespass on private property. Each of you will be held liable for $100,000 in damages. You didn't just RSVP to a party. You signed your own lawsuit." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face twisted, her smugness faltering for the first time as she tried to laugh it off. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp. "You can't sue 200 people at once. You'll look insane." My lawyer stepped forward, holding up the pre-drafted documents, and replied, "Actually, we can. And we will. Every single person here is on camera. Every single person ignored posted warnings. Every single one is trespassing." The murmurs grew louder. Some guests began stepping backward toward their cars, realization dawning that this wasn't the glamorous event they were promised but a legal trap waiting to snap shut. Karen tried to rally them, waving her arms and shouting, "He's bluffing. This is my authority as HOA president. You're all guests of the community, not trespassers." But even the sheriff, who had pulled up at the edge of the crowd to monitor the chaos, stepped forward and shook his head. "She doesn't speak for this property," he said, his voice carrying weight. "The owner does. And the owner is standing right there. You're all trespassing, and if you don't leave, it'll only get worse." That was the nail in the coffin. People started rushing for their cars, tripping over gowns and knocking over tables as they scrambled to get away. Caterers abandoned trays, musicians dropped instruments, and decorations fluttered to the ground in the chaos. The spectacle that Karen had promised as her grand triumph was crumbling into a humiliating circus, with neighbors filming on their phones, laughter ringing out as they captured the downfall of the woman who had tormented them for years. I heard one man mutter, "Guess she's not so powerful now," as he snapped a photo of Karen standing frozen in front of the gate, her party unraveling around her. Karen screamed at me then, a sound more desperate than powerful, demanding that I stop, that I cancel the lawsuits, that I think of the community. But I simply replied, calm as ever, "You thought you could turn my home into your stage. Now it's your courtroom." The sheriff nodded, validating my words, and the lawyer handed Karen the first packet with her name printed clearly on it. "You'll be hearing from us very soon," he said. She ripped it in half, threw the papers on the ground, but even that was caught on camera, evidence of her defiance and proof that she had been served. Around her, the once proud crowd of 200 dwindled to a scatter of cars fleeing down the road, dust kicking up behind them, the sound of engines drowning out her shouts. And just like that, the mansion was mine again, silent, untouched, except for the wreckage of her failed spectacle lying in ribbons and broken tables across the lawn. In the days that followed, the lawsuits began rolling out one by one, each name, each address, each charge meticulously filed. Panic spread quickly through the community as word got around that Karen's guests were being dragged into court for damages they never imagined. Some settled immediately, paying out of fear of higher costs. Others tried to fight, but the video evidence, the signs, and the sheriff's testimony made the cases airtight. Karen herself faced not only personal lawsuits but also a wave of backlash from the very people she had invited. The investors she had promised prestige to pulled out, furious that she had misled them. The HOA board, once loyal to her, voted her out of the presidency when they realized she had not only failed but had endangered them all financially. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak against her now laughed openly at her downfall. At the store, I overheard one man say, "Remember when she thought she owned the mansion? Now she can't even walk past it without people pointing." The humiliation spread beyond the community. Local papers covered the fiasco with headlines like "Birthday Bash Turns into Legal Bloodbath" and "HOA President Faces 200 Lawsuit." Social media took the story and ran with it, memes popping up of Karen holding giant scissors with captions like "Cut the ribbon, cut your future." Videos of her shouting in front of my gate went viral, set to music and mockery, ensuring her legacy was sealed in ridicule. I didn't need to say much. The world did it for me. And as the fallout consumed her, I went back to my routines. I rebuilt the lawn, cleaned up the debris, and sat once more on my porch with coffee in hand, listening to the quiet lap of water against the dock, the mansion standing proud as it always had. As I sat one evening with the lake glowing orange under the setting sun, I thought of the entire ordeal and felt nothing but calm satisfaction. Karen had tried to turn my life into a spectacle, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that became the show. And now I'll turn to you, the one listening to this story. Have you ever faced a Karen or an HOA like this, someone who thought your boundaries were theirs to cross? If yes, how did you handle it? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that dignity is not something you ask for. It's something you defend. And sometimes the best revenge is not rage, but patience, preparation, and a trap so perfect that your enemy destroys themselves in front of everyone.